Thanks for having me, everyone. I think I think I packed the room with my friends, hopefully. And some old new friends are in the room as well. Um, we are going to talk about how climate disruption is already changing our forests, especially in the cities. Many of our habitat and tree care practices are still based on assumptions about how forests used to regenerate, not how plants are responding now. This session, I'm hoping, explores how learning from the plants themselves and a variety of knowledge systems can help us adapt to a rapidly changing climate with more clarity, humility, and responsibility. Um, Before I get into it, I just want to I think if everyone gets a TTF newsletter, they released the strategic plan yesterday, and I think it really sets the stage for what I'm going to talk about today. I don't know, so I want to really congratulate the staff and the board and the partners and residents who contributed to this work.
A lot
If
over
you're
a certain amount,
if
you
you're a
want
fan of
to
strategic
yeah,
plans,
yep,
uh,
yep. You know,
feel free, just as Donna did, you can unmute and just shout out loud how much you like the strategic plans. I think too, I really want to make this interactive. And as well, if you're feeling a little shy, you can just smash a little heart emoji or a little thumbs up, whatever you're into. All right. Um, and then a little bit more about me. Muted.
Michael, you're muted.
Oh, geez. You got me? Okay. Um, I may use the global we or the we for who I think is in the Zoom room, but I speak from my positionality, multiple identities, and communities of practice. For example, my day job is focused on stewardship of urban forestry green spaces. I have a few degrees and certifications as an arborist and restoration practitioner. I'm also a middle-aged white guy, homeowner in South Tacoma, and a father. So that's where I speak from. And just a little bit more about my journey. My day job for years has partially been to find the most efficient and effective ways to eradicate so-called invasive species from the land in order to build a healthy future forest. When I first got into restoration, my reference point was big old growth forests, big trees, deep shade, moss everywhere. They were the model I compared everything else to. So urban forests were described as degraded, too young, too disturbed, too full of the wrong species, and I absorbed that without really realizing it. I know now comparison is a very human emotion, how we rank things when we're trying to figure out where we belong. And I realized I was doing that with forests. I was ranking them as I was trained to do. This one is whole, the other one is broken. But the more time I spent in urban forests, the more I saw what they weren't failed old growth forests. They were ecosystems shaped by roads, heat, power relations, and history, full of life that had figured out how to live there. When I only compared them to something else, I missed what was actually there. And I do think that's what we do with species too, individual species or individual plants. We're nostalgic for a past we can't return to, and and we need to decide what doesn't belong and what belongs. So instead of asking whether a forest or a species matches an old picture, a better question these days is whether it is helping life persist in a world we actually live in. So I don't like to bury the lead, but here's what you can expect to hear and discuss this afternoon in the generous of time we have available. Um, I am not going to provide a balanced view of alienated or quote unquote so-called invasive species. I think you can, I have a growing reputation of saying nice things about plants, and you can literally find negative aspects or the balanced opinions literally anywhere else on the internet, or any other ISA trainings for that matter. I also attempt to speak from my perspective of critical ecology and agitate and hopefully speak pragmatically about how our climate has been disrupted and provide ways we can be together to have urban forests in our future. So this is the climate reality. I just want to start here. This is the climate reality restoration habitat care are working within. We'll often hear 1.5 degrees talked about as the future threshold at which time the world begins to change. But what the data are telling us is that this is no longer theoretical. This is the operating context we're already in. Habitat management today isn't about preventing change. It's about learning how to care for land under conditions that are already warmer, more variable, and less predictable. Um, this this slide shows the climate changes. Yeah, again, not a future scenario. We're already observing some of these things through increasingly hotter days and warmer nights. Um, Intensity of extreme heat events, increasing temperature and ocean acidity, rising level and storm surges, reduced snowpack, which affects the amounts of water in our streams, increased precipitation on the beginning and the tail end of the year, increased frequency of heavy rainfall events like we saw like a month ago, which created some flooding, and then increased fires and forests burned. Now, this I feel like can really create yeah, a sense of grief, and that's what we see in the news. But also, I think this paper from a few years ago really gave me a sense of some of the positive emotions that can come from seeing our climate disrupted and being on the front lines with the forests themselves. So I think they can also stir a bunch of awe and gratitude and optimism and actually feelings of like we can make change and we can ride through climate disruption together. So, Adele, I lost my notes. I gotta start again. Hold on a sec.
Take your time. No
Shit.
worries.
Sorry. There was some animation in that one. Drove me crazy.
It's fine.
How's that?
Perfect.
Okay? Okay.
Yep.
Sorry.
Oh
Um,
no.
what's that?
Keep going. You're doing great.
Okay. So how do we respond to these impacts and change I shared just a few slides back. I'm a big fanboy of Adrienne Marie Brown, who explores community and how we can learn to live with the change in her books, Emergent Strategy, Pleasure Activism, and Holding Change. She teaches us that being in right relationship with change means responding instead of resisting, listening instead of forcing, and staying flexible as conditions shift. So adaptation is not about fixing the future, it's about learning how to move with and change is not a failure of the system, it's how living systems grow and reorganize. So this brings us to the RAD framework, which I think provides my brain a little bit of a way to wrap our heads around like very simple ways to categorize adaptation responses to climate impacts. So this resist, accept, direct framework comes from climate adaptation science and helps us decide what to hold on to, what to let go of, and when to help shape what comes next. So resist means protecting places and species that are under stress and still hanging on. So that means cool, wet refugia of wetlands and north-facing slopes that shelter heat-sensitive species like our western red cedar and big leaf maple. So it's about buying time and supporting vulnerable species. Just like the refugia, I feel like is a very poignant word. Accept means recognizing that some changes are already here and cannot be reversed. In urban forests, this often shows up in the presence of weeds and non-native species that tolerate heat, compaction, and disturbance better than many natives. Acceptance doesn't mean doing nothing. It means noticing what's surviving and asking what roles those plants are playing in a cooling, soil cover, and habitat as providing habitat right now. And then direct means intentionally shaping future ecosystems rather than trying to restore the past as it was. This includes choosing species and seed sources that can handle hotter, drier conditions, and working with forests for, again, shade and cooling, and planning for new species mixes that haven't existed before. Now I'm gonna sit with no, I've named a couple of things. I don't know who's in the room right now, but just for definition's sake, I want to yeah, really just kind of define what these mean to me. And some of these are very common definitions. A native usually refers to species that were present in a place before large-scale colonial or industrial disturbance, but the exact baseline is often unclear and value laden. Words that I grew up using were adapted and quote unquote appropriate. Um, Invasive is commonly used to describe species that spread aggressively and cause concern, yet the term mixes ecological observation with fear-based or moral judgment rather than focusing on conditions driving that spread. Using terms like native, non-native, and invasive, I would say can be straightforward, but also subjective and vague and confusing depending on the audience you're talking to. And this another word, adaptive shifts that focus away from where a species comes from and toward what it can tolerate or contribute under current and future conditions, helping us make more practical, context-aware decisions in a changing world. Now, I believe in this term and this concept has been highly debated in ecological restoration circles. But novel ecosystems are plant and animal communities that have formed under human influence and changing climate, creating species combinations that have never existed before. So in urban natural areas, that often looks like mixes of native and introduced species growing together in soils shaped by roads, fill, heat, and disturbance. Restoration scholars debate about whether these systems should be returned to historical conditions or cared for as new living ecosystems that still provide all the services that we're interested in. So for my philosophical and my practical home, ecological restoration, I belong to this society, and ecological restoration is defined by the SER as a process of assisting the recovery of ecosystems that have been damaged, degraded, or destroyed. That's full stop. That's been the traditional definition for a while. These terms carry historical and cultural meaning as much as ecological ones. So those terms degraded, damaged, and destroyed are really a little bit subjective. Restoration aims not only to support ecological processes and biodiversity, but also reflect values regarded as inherent in the ecosystem and provide goods and services people value, which I think is an important definition. And so restoration is often understood as a third wave of environmentalism, moving beyond preservation and conservation towards active, ongoing care in landscapes already shaped by human history. So these principles that we live by, I think the first four are really important to focus on. Engaging stakeholders. This is what we're doing today. This is part of my practice, like sharing information, technology, drawing on many types of knowledge, not only Western science, but indigenous wisdom and local know-how, I think is super important. It also focuses on using historical reference conditions and supporting ecosystem recovery through native species and processes. So while these principles offer us an important ethical anchor, more and more I tend to believe the focus on historical baselines and nativeness can become rigid when applied to landscapes already shaped by colonization, climate disruption, and rapid urbanization. So novel ecosystems are now the reality more than the exception. As one of my favorite writers talks about, Emma Maris, nativism can be understood as a form of intellectual humility, using the past as a guide rather than a blueprint, but it must be held alongside transparency about our values, openness to future-facing pluralistic approaches to care. So one particular human history was redlining as a federal housing policy from the 1930s that ranked neighborhoods in cities like Seattle and Tacoma by quote unquote risk, using racist ideas about who lived there to deny loans and investment to whole communities. The Mapping Inequality project shows how these judgments labeled many Black, immigrant, and working class neighborhoods as undesirable, shaping where trees, parks, and green infrastructure were or were not built. These maps just didn't describe neighborhoods. They graded them from best to hazardous using openly racist language about Black, Asian, Jewish immigrant residents to justify disinvestment. Areas marked in red were labeled risky, typically because of who lived there, which meant fewer loans, fewer trees, fewer parks, and more exposure to highways and industry and pollution. Today, when we see hotter temperatures and lower canopy in those same places, we are not looking at a natural pattern. We are seeing the long environmental afterlife of racist policy decisions. So this map shows that Tacoma's tree canopy has grown to about 21%, thanks in part to trees growing, new planting, and care. But neighborhoods that were historically redlined show often double-digit differences during heat events and more than their more forested or shoreline neighbors. That tells us the benefits of trees and shade are not evenly shared, and the gap between neighborhoods is shaped by past and ongoing decisions where investment and care went. So huge thanks to so yeah, well, okay, it appeared. That was a slow fade. Oh my God. So huge thanks. You can see it. So this the data on the right is showing huge thanks to the volunteers who drove around during the summer heat events and collected this street level heat data that shows these patterns and makes them visible so we can act on them. So I want to make this simple point that green and blue infrastructure both cool our neighborhoods, whether that comes from patches of forest, street trees, vacant lots, or water. Cooling doesn't only come from perfect landscapes, it comes from whatever can hold shade, moisture, and life in hot places. And yes. And some of the data backing this up, that a nationwide study that we are involved in 2023, led by our friends at the Natural Areas Conservancy, found that forested natural areas are consistently the coolest places in cities, often several degrees cooler than streets, buildings, and even landscape parks, like golf courses or places where there's lots of green turf. So across the 12 cities that were part of the study, forests cooled air temperatures at over 90% of the study sites. And while healthier forests are usually the coolest, even forests classified as quote unquote degraded still provided significant cooling compared to non-forested areas. The key takeaway is that imperfect, stressed, or disturbed forests still protect people from heat, making them essential climate infrastructure, not low value land waiting to be fixed or replaced. So non-native trees do not automatically mean a forest is broken or failing. Based on some data I've looked at, I'm going to spitball an estimate that like potentially 5 to 10% of urban forests is made up of trees labeled invasive. And in some green spaces, they make up much more of what's growing. But the bigger driver of heat and stress is how land we've covered with pavement and buildings. When we call these places degraded, we often blame plants for conditions created by roads, redlining, and impervious surfaces. So these are some of the when I'm talking about non-native things or alienated beings, these are the woody plants I've spent much of my career cutting, digging, and managing in forests and natural areas. Some of these you'll recognize whether no matter where you're zooming in from, because they thrive in disturbed, compacted, and overheated landscapes across the nation. Rather than being strange exceptions, they're doing pretty extraordinary ecological things like growing fast, reproducing easily, occupying light, soil, and water where other species struggle to establish. So, and then there's a little plain language summary on the political classification system. There's class A's, B's, and C's, and these are species that are somewhat widespread and are out targeted for control or either managed through education and selective action and eradication. None of these are regulated or required for removal by the state. So we're making decisions on our own to remove these. And these plants often cool hot streets and parking lots by growing fast, holding their leaves longer, and creating shade where pavement traps heat. Their roots help steady loose or compacted soil, and many can survive pollution, salt, and poor growing conditions, while also catching dust and nutrients from the air. They also provide useful materials and medicine, and their flowers, fruits, and branches give food and shelter to birds and insects in places where few other plants can live. Now, we can say their main offense is often simply that they take up space under the conditions some people have created, which makes them useful teachers about which plants are best suited for urban spaces. One gritty trait and register of belonging is that plants can survive and reproduce on their own without our intervention. And this is actually what we want from our native species to do, but there are so often challenges. Many native trees and shrubs struggle to regenerate on their own in urban understories because soils are compacted or covered in overabundant plants. Seed sources are missing, and heat and drought make it hard for seedlings to survive. So instead of waiting for forests to passively replant themselves, we often have to help by collecting seed, growing plants in nurseries, and planting them into places that they can no longer reach on their own. And some adaptive traits that often invasive species hold is that trees move water through xylem. And species use different plumbing styles that affect how they handle abnormally dry and drought conditions. So ring porous trees like oaks and black locusts rely on big early season vessels that move water fast but are more vulnerable when soils dry out, while diffuse porous trees like maples and mountain ash use many smaller vessels that are slower but safe under stress. My favorite tree, madrone, and species like tree of heaven and butterfly bush add another strategy by combining tough wood, deep or aggressive roots, and drought-tolerant physiology, showing that survival in hot, dry urban soils depends on both xylem structure and broader water use traits. So these plants provide real measurable services in cities, again, I'm saying cooling streets a lot, but tolerating pollution, offering medicine, and creating canopy where few others can survive. So beyond utility, they shape daily relationships, appearing in yards, along sidewalks, and in overlooked spaces where people form caring, memory, and meaning with land. Recognizing their intrinsic value reminds us that they're not simply management problems, but living responses to conditions that we may have created, or some people have created, and signals us to pay attention. So next, I want to give some concrete examples. I think I've been talking kind of hypothetically. I've created some plant monographs, which are short, focused profiles of individual species that bring together ecological, medicinal, and cultural information in one place. They look at who the plant is, which parts are used, and what it does in the body, and associated with its health benefits. And I use them in this talk to highlight these lesser known benefits of some familiar plants to invite people to slow down and learn more deeply about species we usually ignore or rush to judge. So for me, herbal actions, I've given this presentation a few times. Herbal actions describe how plants work in the body. This is what because we often shop in the grocery store and pharmacy these days, many of these benefits of plants have been invisibilized. Some calm the nervous system. Some of us need this. Some of us, I'm going to say the we in the Zoom room, they calm the nervous system and lift mood. Others fight infection, reduce inflammation. Some stop bleeding. Some support digestion. These effects often come through taste and texture too, like bitters that stimulate the liver or demulcents that soothe irritated tissues. Reconnecting with medicinal and food plants also supports the return of ancestral food and healing systems grounded in relationship. So walking this back and bringing it to the household scale, you can call it coincidence, or maybe it happened for a reason, but this is my first house in Tacoma. We started living there about 10 years ago. Had all the things, good price, good schools, nice trees, etc. Looking at this house was a real estate agent. Honestly, I may not have invested in this house if I identified this tree correctly. I was not expecting to see such a large specimen of this highly adaptable species. Seen growing out of cracks and crevices and cement patios, truly adaptive, this tree can grow almost anywhere in the built environment where there's enough soil to support its germination and seedling growth. This is a tree of heaven, is a rapidly growing deciduous tree. Sweetest name for, I think, a tree that most people despise. Although I have learned people also refer to this tree as ghetto palm. I've also heard trash tree and shit, basically. So this is not an easy relationship with this tree. I pulled seedlings out regularly, dug out root sprouts, but we also live in Tacoma, a city with 20-ish% canopy cover, the lowest of any urban area in the Puget Sound region, and it's not getting any cooler in the neighborhoods. Well, and this tree provided needed shade to my house. So writer Matthew Gandy, if you like to continue to geek out about this, highlights the ideological ambiguity of Ailanthus altissima in urban ecology, noting that it has been both planted as a street tree in years past for almost 200 years in the United States, and then later forgotten, only to reappear in inhospitable, disturbed spaces because of its ability to thrive in hot, dry, marginal conditions. Um, so it's a symbol of cosmopolitan urban ecology, and its presence in cities tells a story about historical planting practices, urban transformation, climate tolerance, and the values embedded in how we classify and manage plants. Its long history in Chinese medicine, where the roots, leaves, and bark have been used as an astringent. Its early introduction to Europe in the 1740s and to the United States in 1784, where it was initially valued as a garden tree. So it's obvious I'm a little biased towards some things. I totally want to acknowledge that. I think everyone else should as well. Bias shapes how we judge plants in the way it shapes how we judge people too. Naming these biases help us slow down, question our assumptions, and make more thoughtful decisions. So essentially, affinity bias. Like I'm familiar with Ailanthus altissima because it's a tree species I didn't grow up with, but I live near in this house. Confirmation bias is a plant labeled invasive is closely watched, even surveilled for its negative impacts, while their benefits go unnoticed. Every reappearance is seen as a proof of a problem. The halo horn is so example of that is a fast-spreading plant is judged entirely on its ability to dominate space, overshadowing other traits like erosion control or medicinal value. Alternatively, native species are assumed to beneficial in all contexts, even where it struggles. The stereotyping signifies it's assumed to that plant is always assumed to always behave the same way. Regardless of site conditions, its reputation travels faster than observation. And then contrast, plants are judged against an idealized reference forest rather than the realities of the site conditions. The comparison obscures what the site actually needs. And then the groupthink, and we're all guilty of this, and it's helpful in our culture. A team sticks with a familiar management language and approaches because that's how it's always been done, even when outcomes aren't improving. So for me, and maybe you, adopting new habits or practices starts with our framing and words. Just language and ecology education began during the era of the COVID pandemic. The group examined and attempts to shift the way people talk about ecology, especially language rooted in fear, war, or exclusion, so that ecological education and stewardship can be more inclusive, equitable, and culturally aware. Over a few years of online meetups and organizer meetings, we developed a few resources for you to use. So there's a conservation guide that helps people understand why ecological language matters, how traditional terms like invasive can carry violent or xenophobic connotations, and what questions ask as you explore more intentional alternatives. And then there's a language guide that offers suggested terminology alternatives and invites practitioners to consider how different words can foreground human involvement, ecological context, and relational understanding rather than fear or blame. And then on the right here, if you have time for a longer read, Claire Foreman's forthcoming book called Scapegoat studies the language used in invasive species discussions and how it affects science, policy, and public understanding. The book I was interested. Even her graduate thesis highlights the role of plastic words, which are vague but authoritative terms that can simplify complex ecological relationships. And you'll catch me using them as well, like terms like management, control, impact, risk, health. These are often Latin terms that are just more complex. And so, yeah, this book's it's right here, but I was using it as a mouse pad for Make Press. And so words do matter. This is one of the most extreme examples of the like the impact focused approach that sways decision making. Wanted posters as an invasive species trope doubles down on combative rhetoric. This has arisen with the policing of species. Because print media back in the day customarily disseminated information about the top 5 most wanted lists for criminals. And now conservation has adopted this to regulate species for control and eradication. So wanted posters have a long history. They became a tool as early as the 1700s for slavers to track down Black people who had liberated themselves. Wanted dead or alive posters of invasive species mimics law enforcement advertising fake bounties and soliciting public cooperation, help, and even participation to apprehend alleged criminals or escaped species. So speaking of holly, this is Ilex aquifolium, a plant that sits at the complicated intersection of habitat care, pagan nostalgia, and noxious weed designation. While often viewed as a holiday decoration or landscape ornamental, holly has escaped cultivation and now thrives in urban forests, including here in the Pacific Northwest. Politically, holly's current status as a noxious weed in Washington has stirred a lot of attention. Public hearings about its listing expose how native plant values, aesthetics, and nursery interests all influence what plants get labeled as threats. So who is this plant? It's a slow, low-growing evergreen, spiny leaves, bright red berries, birds feed on them. Medicinally, it's the leaves, not the berries that have been used in traditional European herbalism. In small amounts, holly leaf tea was once used as a febrifuge to reduce fever and sometimes as a diuretic or mild laxative. These uses are uncommon today, but they remind us that so-called weeds often carry legacies of healing and seasonal ritual. So yeah, think of reefs too. This is one of the sweetest articles from some indigenous authors as well as some non-marked authors as well. Rain et al. Show that arguments about whether a species belongs are not just scientific, they're shaped by different value systems or registers of belonging that people use to make sense of nature. Some focus on nativeness, others on wildness, contributions to what it provides to ecosystems and people, or right relations. Yeah, this is a good read. So more and more restoration practitioners in the Pacific Northwest are using some of the species showing on this slide. These species are sometimes viewed as suspicious because they're planted outside a narrow historical baseline, even though they are native to nearby regions or climates similar to what we are moving toward. In practice, they are often treated as assisted migration, which means bringing whole species into places where they may have not grown during the colonial snapshot used to define nativeness. So the tension really is often focused on biology, but also about where we understand restoration as a past moment in time, supporting living instead of supporting living systems as they respond to climate and changing conditions. So, and that has to do with there's a fancy word called provenance, which means the natural place a tree or seed traditionally comes from, usually defined by its geographic source in the world. So in forestry, this helps distinguish a plant's true ecological origin from where it is grown in a nursery or how it was propagated. So knowing provenance matters because trees from different places can vary in how they handle heat, cold, drought, and disease, even when they are the same species, like they look the same, essentially. Instead, oh, that's so funky font. I'm sorry, it's so embarrassing. Instead of replacing species at times, different sourcing strategies help us choose seed from the same species, but from places with climates closer to what we expect in the future. So strict local providencing uses seed from nearby populations, perhaps within the same watershed. Relaxed providencing expands that area to where we can pull seed from. And then composite providencing mixes seed from several regions to increase our genetic options. This approach lets us move away from the ideal that local is best and instead match trees to the climate that we are likely to face over their lifetime. And so we often pull from sometimes it's not all or nothing, but from the a couple degrees of latitude south in the region in the ecoregion south of us, the Willamette Valley. Um, yeah, I'm just gonna skip over this, but this is yeah, available on the slideshow and really talks about some of the benefits and risks and some of the caveats associated with different provenance strategies. Ooh, I'm gonna get into this one. I might sort of wrap up pretty soon, but I've got a few more to go. This is common ivy. This is kind of a hot take at the end here. Um, One of the most frequently removed plants in our urban forests, yet it is also well known for its medicinal and functional uses. It's a climbing vine in the ginseng family, whose primary medicinal part is the leaf. It has long been used to support respiratory health, contains antioxidants, and has been shown to reduce certain indoor air pollutants. Today, ivy extracts are common in cough syrups and skincare products, but maybe if you peek around your pharmacy aisle, you might find some. Um, so again, it's often used as an expectorant or a bronchodilator, has anti-inflammatory, antimicrobial properties. Today, it appears in teas, tinctures, and over-the-counter cough syrups, like I said. So it's culturally linked to Saturn, which is associated with endurance and structure, and to the Celtic Green Man. And again, Class C, meaning control is recommended but not required. Now, it has been studied not in North America, but in Europe, as in vertical greenery systems, also called green walls, which are known to reduce airborne pollutants like fine particles and nitrogen dioxide by trapping them on leaf surfaces and slowing air movement. And English ivy already performs this function naturally along walls, highways, and on our trees. So ivy-covered slopes and tree trunks beside acts as living filters and shade structures, surviving heat, exhaust, compacted soils where other plants can't persist. Um, this creates a novel forest structure because we have very few native vines that can form dense vertical cover, making ivy one of the only plants currently adapted to provide that kind of vertical cooling and pollution buffering. So I think this is an argument for balancing rather than automatically removing all ivy along roadways, at least. I think anyway, this is probably going to have some questions, but um, I yeah, I think yeah, given the roadside pollution and the flattening of hot and heat events, I think this deserves some look this local context. Um, yeah, this is the last one, but hawthorn is a good example of how medicine and management collide in urban forests. And this hit me personally a few years ago, showing how some adoration for this tree is collided with our management decisions at a popular Seattle park. Um, we had been using the EasyJet plants as a stem injection tool that delivers herbicide directly into the woody plants like hawthorn, allowing control without spraying leaves or doing foliar applications and helping reduce drift and off-target damage. So this tool matters because it represents a very literal decision about which plants are allowed to stay and which are removed. Hawthorn can be a medicine in one context and target for injection in another. This campaign in the park started before my herbalism journey, and I think I might have proceeded a bit slower, pump the brakes a little bit if I knew then what I know now, because hawthorn has been long used as a heart ally, supporting circulation and strength through cardio as a cardiotonic, and its antioxidant actions, while offering gentle nervous system and digestive support. Culturally, it carries meanings of vitality and comfort from the sun, and protection and boundaries from Mars, linking the physical heart health like emotional with emotional heart qualities like compassion and resilience. So ending here reminds us that decisions about plants are also decisions about our relationships, and that care, community voice, and love are part of what we choose, what belongs, and how we live with change. Um, yeah, and I think too, if we bring, I disclaimer, I can't really speak for indigeneity or indigenous voices, but this idea of an honorable harvest, popularized by Robin Wall Kimmerer, teaches us that taking from the land should be done with respect, restraint, and reciprocity rather than extraction. I think the two principles I feel unfamiliar in modern land management are asking permission and pausing to notice whether a plant community can afford what we want to take, and using everything, which means avoiding waste and letting harvest support regeneration instead of just disposing it like trash. So applied to habitat care, this invites us to treat so-called weeds not just as a material to remove, but as part of a balanced relationship where removal, use, and renewal are connected. Yeah, so I'm gonna end there, Della. Thank you for spending this time with me, talking about plants and cities and change. I'm grateful to Tree Foundation for hosting this conversation and their ongoing work with tree canopy, community care, and resilience across Tacoma.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah,
This has been really inspiring, and I think it's given us a lot of well, for those of us who might not be doing this work already, a lot of great starting points. I want to just highlight that on the chat, you have a couple of messages. One is that Claire Fullman is in the room. So when you mentioned Claire, they immediately wanted you to know that they're here.
Claire, want to hang out and talk?
Yes, well, I mean, let's connect, right? Well, you guys connect. And then Amy Boucher-Kiss just shared a resource that is about invasive plant threat as well. And she's waving. Do you want to say anything about that, Amy, really quickly, or just wave your hand, which is fine
I used to
too?
work for Metro Parks Tacoma when they the chip-in program. When it used to be Metro Parks Tacoma, I think they've changed their name since. But it was a nice little booklet that our handout we used. We laminated it and printed it for our stewards. And so I just love this because I've been out of restoration for about 5 years now, and this conversation wasn't being shared at this capacity 5 years ago. I feel like there's been a lot of things that have changed within our area of urban habitat restoration. And so this is really awesome and great. And I'm glad I got to attend. And so I just thought I'd share that because it was, the exact stuff that we're talking about, but an easy thing to just share with people.
Good to
Thank
see you, Amy.
Yeah, good to see you too.
you, Amy. And Michael is now taking questions. So I just posted on the chat. Please raise your hand so we can make sure nobody's talking over anyone. And if you prefer for me to read out your question, you can also just put it on the chat. So we'll give people a little bit of time to think. Amy, do you want to get us started?
Actually, so there was some data and some mapping that I seen, and this was something that I really was trying to work on while at Metro Parks, but wasn't really able to get it lifted up. But I know there's the tree plotter, Tacoma was working on that, and but it was all focused on like tree inventory versus like actual plants. And so I did do my master's at UW Tacoma in the geospatial technologies, and I worked on one of my capstone was creating a mapping, a data collection tool for municipalities, cities, governments, whatever, and to track volunteer work that was being done in our natural areas. But I'm curious, is there anything like that? I have, I have like the template, but I have been so detached from GIS and habitat restoration for, like I said, about 5 years. So I don't know if that's something that's been done. And if there's somebody that is interested in pursuing that, I do have a really good framework to do something with that, if anyone's interested. So I guess my question to you is there a tool, a data collection tool?
Not that I know of, unless someone else has an answer. I mean, I feel like actually, I don't know if Dylan's about to answer you. We see him just popped up. No, he's got another answer. I don't know. I think aside from maybe iNaturalist or something like that, but the sort of mapping tool. Yeah, if you could drop that more in the chat, and then I might I'm gonna have to follow up with that one.
I will send you because there's some grammatical errors in my capstone paper, but
Yeah.
I would like to send that to you, and if you know of other people that you could share that to, and if this is something that there's a group of people that would want to work on this, I would be more than willing to take on that task to start that work up and
Yeah.
see if we can use it.
Okay. Thank you.
Amy, Dylan, before you go, we have another question on the chat that came up a couple minutes ago. Michael, you're being asked if you could please clarify the tree of life,
Hmm.
and the participant is
Right.
wondering if they're confusing it with the tree of heaven. Um, which is
I was talking specifically about Tree of Heaven. I noticed that question is a host for spotted lanternfly, which is much I feel like has had some impacts back east. Has not made it our way yet. Also, while it's being a host for the spotted lanternfly, I would say the biggest target for spotted lanternfly is monocultures of hops and grapes. So really in agricultural areas, that's why I would say that's the principal reason why it's politically categorized as so high as an invasive species because it endangers capital, really. So like a few trees, and as far as like density is concerned in like our urban area, I really don't see a lot of tree of heaven. So just like this issue with kind of the hosts for emerald ash borer and the Oregon ash in our areas, like I don't know if the density would support like growing and thriving populations of insects, but insects aren't my thing. And again, my talk was mostly talking about some of these invisibilized benefits of some of these species that we might just normally overlook. So, but I have some opinions about it too. So,
Dylan?
Hey, Michael, thank you for the presentation. So I'm Dylan from Haven Ecology and Research. Michael, I have a question. It's going to sound really snarky, and I just want you to know
it's okay, man. I'm used. I know.
it's
I
a
like talking.
sincere question. Most of your presentation really focused on the values and benefits of invasive species, like species from completely different continents, not near native species that are like further down south from where
Mhm.
you're based in Tacoma, like in Oregon or California. So my like snarky but honestly sincere question is, so why remove invasive species at all if they provide so many benefits? Or if we are going to remove some, why, like, how do we decide which invasive species to
Yeah,
remove, given that every
totally.
species has probably got someone who loves it?
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, and again, it's just that trap value transparency, thinking about yeah, in not every context, I'm not always about like this ubiquitous copy and paste template. And in some cases we can, it's not saying like our role as humans is always to play like a balancing role in the ecosystem, I believe. So I'm not saying don't remove species that you don't desire or that are harmful or as safety concerns. Like we need to do that as arborists protecting public safety. But in some cases we can always have a plan to replace things. So not just like a lot of times I feel like we just privilege a lot of bare ground. We remove things without sometimes a plan to replace them. So yeah, and near native species as well. I think more and more some of those trees I mentioned in that one slide, I think they have a place, whether or not they're in the natural areas or on the edges. I think there's a lot of value. And like in the state of Tacoma, we're using probably a dozen different species, which historically, like back in the day, 20 years ago when I started this career, we wouldn't have even like considered those species because they came from the other side of the mountains or they came from Oregon or across these weird political boundaries that don't really mean anything. So sorry, I know it was a rambling response, but
Thanks,
appreciate it,
Great,
Michael.
thank
Dylan.
you.
Appreciate it.
I want to be mindful of time. We have 2 hands up and then 2 questions in the chat. The first, I'm going to go with a chat question first because it relates to what you just answered. It is citing the removal of cottonwood to clear space in the Tacoma port, and with using the same criteria of low value. And the question is, how can we change that conversation, especially in those spaces with so little green space or canopy?
Yeah, no, I agree, and it's off. Unfortunately, there's like private parcels, private owners of land basically can remove things at their discretion, especially if they're vetted through, the planning department a lot of times with big removals. So yeah, cottonwoods are one of those individual plants that just grow humongous and are probably best suited for like untamed, like big spaces. And I come in contact with neighbors who have recently moved into a home and they have on the edge of a wetland and they have gigantic cottonwoods and they're so freaked out about them. So yeah, cottonwoods have their place, but sometimes yeah, they're just they can be treated like they can be treated like pests because yeah, we live in such close proximity to these big scary beings.
Thanks, Michael. We'll
Yeah.
go with Seth, Glenn, and then I'll read a final question from the chat if there's time. So Seth,
Ooh,
do you want to start? Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I'm joining from Atlanta.
Ooh.
My question was, especially as we're changing the way we talk about these different plants and species, when we're talking with folks that we might need to otherwise convince to put the time, labor, resources towards these restoration efforts, how can we still convey a sense of importance or urgency on the work while still refraining from some of these more buzz or plastic words?
Yeah. It's true. Yeah, hopefully if you dig into the language guide and the conversation guide, we kind of vetted that through, several years of conversations. So I don't want to like just defer your question, just go read the thing. I mean, I would say depending on your audience, like if you're speaking with a group of immigrants, like it becomes very apparent when you use some of this language. Um, some of my comrades with Just Language Group, like it just gets really uncomfortable and you can see it on their faces. Either they've totally adopted our invasive species language, or sometimes audiences have just like they don't know what we're saying because we're using this terminology that's more suited for like accounting or like finance or whatever. So the word manage or control, you could read Claire's book too. Yeah, it's like, or Claire's thesis, honestly. And I think about where some of these words came from, where they originated from, and how we've like adapted them for our own purposes. But really, like the rise of invasion biology coincided with World War II sort of xenophobic conditions. And so there's a lot of warlike language, like tip of the spear, or like control, or like, using herbicide. We talk about nuking stuff, and it's just like sometimes it's really inappropriate because most of us are like you're wearing a hoodie with a galaxy on it, right? Like I think you're pretty peace loving and like sort of like genial person, and then sometimes we're using the most like inappropriate language and that's associated with militarism. So I think it's like defeats our purposes of trying to create this like more caring world where we can yeah.
Glenn?
I don't think we have too much time to get into the meat of this, but Michael, I'd like to have a follow-up conversation about knotweed specifically and its impact on salmon productivity, impact on water quality. It's something we've struggled with I work for Pierce Conservation District, and we just proposed and secured a big old grant to treat knotweed in our most important salmon run here in Pierce County in South Prairie Creek, Wilkeson Creek. So we have, I think it was Claire's presentation we saw a few years ago at a North Sound Riparian conference, and it kind of blew our minds as on the habitat team here at Pierce City, and we've been working to kind of extract some of these warlike terms and racist terms from our terminology. So I guess we've been on this journey for a while, but this is the first time in our kind of world and that I've encountered this conversation again outside of our team, just coming through the wire. So I really appreciate you guys taking some time and it kind of help us give some more resources to encourage us on our journey. But we are kind of also balancing, like, we came to this point where if we don't do something about this particular invasive weed, we're being told by a lot of experts that it has a outsized detrimental effect on this, precious resource here and precious to some of our other partners, the tribal partners. And so we kind of had to step up into the space of but not, it's kind of a balance of we don't want to go to war with this plant. We appreciate it and are impressed by it, but we also want to not just sit by while the ecosystem shifts into another kind of state, which you can see that state on some of the lower areas of the Puyallup. So anyway, it's kind of a long conversation. I know we're out of time, but I'd love to follow up at the nursery or wherever when we can.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I look forward to that being continued conversation about this with everyone. For example, like knotweed, I just used it. I just tinctured it a few months ago, and I made this medicine for my friend who's challenged with Lyme disease. And so their naturopath had been prescribing capsules of it. And so we had this patch in one of the open spaces across Commencement Bay. And so it's like a small patch growing out of an old roadway. And so we actually, with a group of herbalists from Hawthorne and Honey, we dug it up and used the rhizomes. For the first time, I really got a good look at the rhizomes and worked with them and made this tincture. It tastes not the best, but supposedly it has resveratrol and some of these active ingredients that are super power for your brain, and then also help defend against Lyme. So now it has some hidden benefits that you might not think about all the time. I've had some success getting rid of knotweed with just using just whatever the conservation districts honestly the Noxious Weed Control Board folks, the educators prescribe, really and then I've heard some examples of doing it without herbicide. So, but I know I've never dealt with it actually personally in a very dynamic system with streams that are constantly eroding and moving like that. So, but I do feel it's a balance again in community and in conversation, talking about the best ways to balance out, remove things, but also replace plants and populations with something you think that's more beneficial.
Thank you, Michael. I do want to be mindful of your time. If you have time for one more question.
I can keep it going.
Okay, so we'll have one final question. Wonderful presentation. Invasive plants are often portrayed as having zero ecological value, and we know that's just not true. However, I'm curious about your thoughts when it comes to local wildlife, the native insects and birds, etc., that have evolved with native plants that are being displaced. Aren't we concerned about the huge decline in insects and birds?
Oh, sure I am. Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest threats or the urgency that and why people often tout that we need to remove invasive species because of the impacts on potentially leading to extinction, right? Oh, my friend Joe's here. Sorry, I was distracted. Is because the threats of biodiversity loss and blah blah blah. I mean, a lot of times it depends which city you're in. I mean, if it's your own backyard, yeah, I'm a native plant geek, right? Like I'm not saying go out and plant invasive species, but again, replacing it with something more appropriate. Um, and like I said, with climate change, sometimes some of those tethers between insects and animals is becoming uncoupled, right? So that sort of idea that native insects and native animals are like, which have co-evolved with our native plants, are so tightly entwined anymore. I think is becoming less and less like realistic. So yeah, and like it again, it kind of depends what you count as biodiversity, because a lot of times we only count native plants as biodiversity, and some of these other plants that really, even though they're present and they're taking up space, we don't count them, or we count them as a negative. So yeah, and there are pollinator benefits associated. So it's really like plant by plant, but I think maybe what universally maybe all of us can agree on that we're kind of against monocultures of things, right? We don't like monocultures of Douglas fir, like growing in like corn on our hillsides around the mountaintops. We don't like monocultures of really corn or lots of things. So monocultures of anything is a little, I think, a little more threatening. But I would encourage more diverse plant forms and different kind of like species that can extend flowering from like February, like when tall organ grape flowers, to like late summer when like Douglas aster flowers, right? So you have this like months and months and months of like different plants in your yard in the green spaces that can provide yeah, food and pollination for a variety of different life. So yeah, just like we like diversity in our neighborhoods, in our we like diversity in our forests as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. I think we should probably think of a different event we can organize to keep the conversation going, since there's so much interest and it's such an important issue. And thank you for caring for plants and trees and for our communities. Take care, and we'll see you at our next event. Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you. See ya.
Bye, everyone.
Nos vemos.
Nos vemos. Hasta pronto.